But when you fall off of a pedestal, especially one that's pretty high, you are at rock bottom and there's nothing more you can lose. And so I believe that it was necessary for me to get to that rock bottom so that I had to completely rebuild everything. I couldn't just keep parts of the old Toby and move on. I had to completely start over. And that was a blessing too.
I'm Casey Main, a jaded, hopelessly romantic, health-conscious party girl searching for meaning. And my mission is simple: to make life better, for myself and for you. I believe real change always comes from within, and the Better You podcast was born to discover hidden parts of ourselves and our stories. A safe place where we have real, honest conversations with people from all walks of life to help better understand ourselves so we can become better versions of ourselves. So come along on this journey of discovery with me so you can become a better you. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Better You podcast, where our focus is better understanding our relationship with ourselves. And I am so excited to share today's story with you guys. This guest just has an absolutely incredible story. So simply put, she helped an inmate escape from prison in a dog crate, and they were caught. And then she, of course, ended up going to prison herself. No joke. So this was back in 2006, and it made international news. And I'll actually link to some of the news coverage in the show notes if you want to kind of hear a little bit more about her actual story. It is just very unique and, let's face it, pretty entertaining. But it is also super inspiring because she's now working to help women in prisons use that time to reflect, journal, and work on themselves so that then they can come out completely transformed on the other side, as she did. And in this episode, we will dive into her story and how exactly she did that. I first found out about her when a friend of mine, who was actually her niece, sent me her interview on the Criminal podcast. That is episode 121, and it is titled Off Leash. I'll link to that in the show notes as well in case you're interested in listening to that. That interview really covers all the who, what, when, where of the actual prison break. And when I heard it, I knew I wanted to talk to her to dive more into the why and the how. Why did she decide to do it? And how did it change her and her life? And how did she overcome the repercussions from that decision? Ultimately, it is an incredible story of perspective, which is just super important, especially right now, given the current state of the world. So a little bit more about our guest. Her name is Toby Dorr, and at 46 years old, she founded the Safe Harbor Prison Dog program at Lansing Correctional Facility in Kansas. Nearly 2 years later, Toby abandoned herself and her life after falling in love with a handsome younger man who was doing life for murder. Together on the run after a sensational prison escape, their honeymoon ended with a crash at 100 miles per hour, chased into a tree by a large ensemble of law enforcement. Toby's dive took her to the penal side of prison bars, where she found the time and liberation to begin a transformation. A decade later, Toby has achieved 2 master's degrees, completed her memoir, acquired literary agency, and sold the movie rights to her story. Publication of her memoir is expected soon. Her story has been covered by America's Most Wanted, The Wall Street Journal, Anderson Cooper, and more. Toby, better known as the Dog Lady of Lansing Prison, now inspires women to break free. And in this episode, we discuss how all the busyness that we keep in our life affects our ability to gauge our true happiness, how difficult it is to stand up for and do the things in life that we want to do, the importance of having a victor mindset over a victim mindset when bad things happen, how rock bottom can be a life-changing blessing, the power of journaling to overcome guilt and shame, and letting go of love gone wrong. Before we jump into this absolutely fascinating story and conversation, I do have a favor to ask of all of you. Please press pause right now on whatever app you are listening to the podcast, and if that app allows it, leave a rating. ratings and reviews really just help so much in the podcasting world in terms of discoverability and new people finding the show and growing the show, which I definitely want to do because I'm really loving doing this and bringing all these awesome conversations to you guys. So please help me out. Do me a favor by pressing pause, leaving a quick rating. If you have a little bit extra time, go ahead and write a review. It helps more than you know, and I absolutely appreciate it. I just love getting new reviews and ratings. It just really makes my day. So please, again, rating and review if you can do it. It takes 2 seconds and it means a lot to me. All right, so that is it. We're going to go ahead and jump into this conversation with Toby. Enjoy. Want to start with your story because it is absolutely amazing and just very unique and surprising. And so if you could just start by telling all of us a little bit about yourself and then get into your story of what you've been through.
Okay, that sounds good. Well, my name is Toby Dorr. I live in the Kansas City area, but I'm more known as the dog lady of Lansing Prison. So in 2004, I started a prison dog program because I was determined to do something that made a difference in the world instead of just taking up time on the planet. And dogs and dog rescue has always been a passion of mine. And I just decided that I could start a dog rescue program. And within just a week or so of starting it, someone at our local prison approached me and asked if I was interested in starting a prison dog program. And of course I was. So in 2004, I started Safe Harbor Prison Dog Program with 7 dogs. And in 18 months, it grew to the point where I had rescued 1,000 dogs in 18 months. And I would take dogs into the prison. I'd get them out of shelters. They'd go into the prison and the inmates would train them, and then I'd take them out to local adoptions, and it was just a non-ending cycle of dogs from shelters into homes, more dogs from shelters into homes by way of the prison. But in 2006, I was facing some crisis in my personal life. My dad was dying of cancer, and I was having trouble adjusting to that. I had trouble in my marriage for almost all of the 28 years of my marriage. And I ended up falling in love with one of my dog handlers who was serving a life sentence. And he asked if I would be with him or if I wasn't in prison, if he wasn't in prison. And I said, well, I might. And so that led to him being determined to find a way to get out of prison, which ended up with my helping him to escape by hiding in my dog van during a dog adoption event.
Okay. So, all right, I want to dive into all of that. But first, so you helped him escape from prison, and then you guys had, then that you eventually got caught. But like, how long were you guys on the run together?
12 days. They say 12 days, but actually I think it was 13 because I counted the first day as a day. So just under 2 weeks. We escaped on a Sunday and we got caught Friday night around midnight, almost 2 weeks later.
And it ended in like an actual police chase, right?
A high-speed car chase on the interstate at speeds in excess of 100 miles an hour. And we ended up crashing head-on into a tree.
Oh my gosh. Okay. And so then you got in trouble for that, correct?
I got into trouble. Yes, I did. I served 27 months in prison. And I was devastated. You know, I had never even had a speeding ticket. I'd never even been pulled over. So this whole going to prison or going to jail thing was totally out of character for me. I thought that I knew what it was going to be like because I'd spent so much time inside the prison working with the inmates in my prison dog program, but I wasn't prepared at all. And it was tough. I had a lot of days when I was so down and I thought my life was over. I I was on suicide watch several different times, and I did not think I was going to be able to survive. When I first went to prison or to jail, and my attorney asked for a 2-week continuance, I had a meltdown in court because I told him I can't do 2 weeks in jail. And now when I look back at it, it just is kind of amusing because, of course, I could do 2 weeks in jail. I could do whatever time I had to do. It just depends on how I approached it and how I thought about it in my mind. And I got to the point where I realized that being in jail and being in prison was a huge gift of time because I was so busy in my real life, my life before this, that I didn't have 5 minutes a day for myself. I just kept going and going and going and working and doing and being. But now inside a prison, I realized I didn't have any responsibilities. I didn't have anything that I had to do. I had this huge gift of time. And so I decided to use that time to analyze my life and go back and figure out all the broken places and try to dig deep into those old wounds and figure out what happened to break me in that way. And then visualize the future that I wanted and what would I need to do to heal those broken things.
I love that so much. And I think it's very relevant right now as we're in the midst of this pandemic and all these stay-at-home orders. A lot of people probably feel like they're in some version of a prison. But I love that you were able to switch the perspective to a positive. And it's funny, as you were saying that, like you decided to analyze your life and figure out, where did the breaking happen and then what do you want to change in the future? That sounds so familiar to me in terms of the process I went through when I wrote my book, which was just over, 46 days or something. It was by no means as long as you were in prison, but it was a similar concept of, okay, let me think about like how I got here and where I want to go. And I think there's so much power in that. So I want to dive into that more, but first, just to give us all a little bit more context, you mentioned prior to this happening, you had never even had a speeding ticket, like you were a law-abiding citizen. Like, how would you describe just your overall personality and life prior to this whole ordeal?
Well, looking back now, the way I would describe my life is I was duty bound, I was a perfectionist, and I did not believe that it was okay for me to spend time just on things I wanted to do for the fun of them. That, everything I did had to be because, it was some deliverable. I was checking something off of a checklist. I had a job to do or I had a duty to do. And at the time, I would have told you my life is perfect. I have a beautiful home. I have dogs. I would have just told you my life was perfect. But the fact is that it was that very attitude of believing that my life was perfect and not allowing myself to even suspect I had something wrong in my life. That was the biggest break that I had. And that was what did me in, really. I mean, you just can't keep pulling the wool over your eyes and telling yourself everything's perfect and everything's wonderful when it's not.
Do you think that's why sometimes we keep ourselves so busy is to not allow that to be revealed?
Absolutely. I know it was for me. I had this weird measurement that if I could check 17 things a day off my to-do list, it had been a good day. 17 things. That's a lot of things to check off of a list. Why I picked 17, I don't know, but it was almost an unattainable number. And I kept myself going with that goal of doing 17 things every day that I I would fall into bed at midnight, and I was so exhausted that I would just fall asleep. And I didn't have time in the evening to sit and think about what I'd done that day and if it had made a difference and if it was things I wanted to do and how was my life really going. I think if you keep yourself so busy, you don't allow your brain time to analyze your life.
I completely agree. Were you aware that you weren't happy in your marriage?
No, I wasn't aware of it at all. Two incidents happened. Once I came into the prison, and it was after my dad had to have an emergency surgery, and I'd been at the hospital all night. And the dog handler that I ended up helping escape said to me, "Toby, what's going on in your life? You just look so exhausted. You look so down. You're not yourself." And I was so touched that somebody noticed I was hurting, that,
Mm.
it just kind of opened a door. And then I went on, through a conversation that week, and he asked me where I'd been. And I told him that my dad had had emergency surgery. And he said, "Well, I'm glad your husband was there with you, because that's a pretty traumatic thing to go through." And I said, "Oh, well, he wasn't with me. We got the call at 11 o'clock at night." And my husband said, "Well, you go on up to the hospital. I'm just going to stay here and get some sleep, because there's no sense in both of us missing a night's sleep." And to me, that was normal, because he'd said that same thing time and time and time again at different events in our lives, and just kind of left me to deal with things because he needed to get a good night's sleep. And John Maynard said to me, "Toby, that's not how marriages are supposed to be. Why are you married to him?" And I could not answer the question. And
Wow.
I couldn't stop thinking. Like, for the whole next week, I'd be pumping gas and I'd be thinking, why am I married to him? Why can't I answer that question? I should have an answer for that question. Why is it that this is so difficult to answer?
I think that is such a key point, that sometimes it's our inability to answer what seems like a really simple question that actually is showing us like a really important thing in our life, that it's not until that question is posed that you would think, oh, that's something you had maybe thought about beforehand, but it's not. It usually comes from some external source, and then your
Yes.
ability to answer it is like a huge wake-up call.
And the fact that you can answer it, and you can't stop thinking about it. It's like I can't unhear that question, and I can't forget that I can't answer that question. And then about the same time, my youngest son, who was still living at home, he was 21 at the time, and he said to me, "Mom, why are you still married to him? Why do you let him talk to you that way?" And I said to him at the time, "What do you mean? How does he talk to me?" And so, those two events kind of opened my eyes and made me think, wow, maybe my marriage really isn't what I thought it was.
Yeah. So, all right. So then you decide, you fall in love with this other person who is an unlikely candidate for you to fall in love with. He was
Yes, that's right.
significantly younger than you, on
Yes, he
top of the fact
was.
that he was in prison for life.
That's correct. Yep, that's totally correct.
Do you think, all right, so you fall in love with him, you make this decision to help break him out of prison, you get caught. So this essentially like just blows up your whole world and your life as you know it. Do you think that on some level, and not a conscious level, but on some level it was like you purposely did that to your life because you weren't able to kind of proactively make all those changes, like leaving your husband and maybe finding more meaningful work, finding love again, kind of on a slow, painful, piece by piece process?
I know for a fact it was, because um, 10 years earlier, before the escape, I did tell my husband in a conversation one day that I wasn't happy and I wondered if we should get a divorce. And that's the only time I ever brought it up. And he said, "Oh, that's ridiculous. No judge in the county would give you a divorce. I have a job and I don't hit you." And he said, "And more importantly, your family wouldn't let you divorce me." And I thought, he's right. My family wouldn't want me to get divorced, and I wouldn't be able to stand up to him. So we just never mentioned it again. And 10 years passed. And then during the escape, the only sane thought I had a lot of insane fantasy thoughts, but the only sane thought I had was, I bet they'll let me get a divorce now.
That's so funny because I don't think, can they not let you get a divorce?
No, I know now I could have gotten one. But I also know that at that time of my life, I wasn't strong enough to stand up to my family when they would have said, "Why are you getting a divorce?" And I wouldn't have been able to list why I was getting a divorce because I didn't know. I just knew that it wasn't what I wanted. And so I knew at that time I wasn't strong enough to stand up for myself and just do it anyway.
Yeah, well, and I think that's something I know I've struggled with that myself, and I think a lot of people do of being strong enough to stand in your truth, as they say, and be like, no, this is what I want just because I want it, and fight against
I
all
don't
of
have to give you
the
a reason
pushback.
why I want it. It just is. So, yeah.
Exactly. Were you close with your family, or like what was that
I
relationship?
was extremely close with my family. I mean, we were a very close knit family and we did a lot of family activities together. But in all honesty, when I look back, I don't think we were real with each other. We all just
Mm,
had the same, oh, everything's perfect, everything's wonderful. Let's just get together and do something fun kind of a thing.
right. And so no one was people weren't necessarily being themselves, like showing up in the family as themselves. It was more, we're getting together and we're doing this, but we're going to all kind of have our masks on.
Yes, exactly. We did wear masks, that's for sure. And even today, there's still, my mom was so wonderful to me through my whole prison sentence. And as soon as I got arrested and brought back to Kansas, she was by my side unfailingly. But she was really the only one in my family that was that way. I have a brother who's really been supportive. Actually, it's Tamir's dad, but he's been wonderful to me. But the rest of my family, we never really did pick back up and build a new relationship. And that's the thing about getting out of prison. You can't just drop back into your life and pick up where you left off because you've kind of stopped where you were, but everybody else's lives have gone on and you're not a part of them anymore. And so when you get out, you really have to rebuild lives and make new connections. And the majority of my family was not interested in that. They were uh, embarrassed of me. I'd embarrassed them. I'd really kind of exposed them as well to the rest of the world as not being perfect, not being from this perfect family. And a lot of them still resent that, even
Right. Because
14 years later.
this made like, did this make national news?
Oh, yes, it made
Yeah.
international news.
What year was this?
2006.
2006. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So there was a lot of embarrassment, judgment, I'm sure, coming from pretty
Mhm.
much anyone who had been in your life
Yes,
prior to that happening.
that's right.
Okay. All right. So let's talk just a little bit about John Maynard.
Okay.
Looking back on it now, I'm sure I know the answer for how you felt in the moment, but looking back on it now, do you think you were in love with him, or was it more the idea of like a very different type of relationship with someone who would be supportive and maybe it's full of excitement, or like, do you think you were in love with him?
Well, there were definitely some fantasy elements in our relationship, that we could dream about this life, that we were going to have this romantic kind of a life, which the reality was the time that we were out, there were a lot of good times in that 2 weeks, but it was also a very tense and unnatural type of a thing. But I was madly in love with John. I was, and he was, and I still believe to this day that he loved me too. And it took me almost 3 years to get over being in love with him. And it wasn't easy. I had to really battle with myself to let go because I knew there could be no relationship. And I knew that it really wasn't a healthy relationship to begin with. But it was a struggle for me to let go. It took a lot of
Yeah.
intentional work.
Yeah. And especially like if that falling in love was very different, I imagine it was, than when or if you fell in love with your first husband,
Yes.
then this whole new experience comes along and it just kind of knocks you like off your feet.
Yes. So I do know now, looking back, that I doubt that I was ever really in love with my first husband. We just dated. We started dating when I was 15. and we never really fought. And so, your relationship just kind of progresses, and the next logical thing to do is to get married. But I was never head over heels madly in love with my husband.
Mm-hmm.
I was in love with the idea of having a family of my own, but I don't think I was that madly in love with my husband. And I don't believe he was madly in love with me either. Looking back, I think that was just there was a marriage of convenience. It was just what we were expected to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think sadly, I think that's very common.
I think so
Okay.
too.
All right. So you get busted
Hmm.
and you get sentenced to this time in jail. So start to walk us through what that process was. Like when this first, like you get the sentencing, like what's going through your mind?
Well, there's this sentencing guidelines that all the states use, and it's kind of like a spreadsheet. So the row is your criminal history, and the column is the crime you were charged with, or something. It could be the other way around. But where you intersect is called the box that you're in. And that box has a suggested sentencing guideline. And the box that I fell into uh, was what's called a border box, which means that you could go to prison or you could just get probation. And generally, people in the border boxes get sentenced to probation, they don't go to prison. But because my crime was such a high profile case and made international news, the prosecutor said, I can't let her off without prison time because the media will crucify me if I do. So I had resigned myself to the fact that I was going to have to do a little bit of time, but I didn't know how much. I was thinking a few months maybe. And when my attorney came to me and said I was going to have to do 21 months, that was my state sentence, I just kind of had a meltdown. I said, I can't do that. That's almost 2 years. I just can't do it. And and my attorney said, Toby, yes, you can. You can do it. And it'll go by in a flash. Well, that part wasn't true. Time does go very slow when you're in prison, but I could do it. And then I got the federal sentence, and it was 27 months, but they ran concurrently. And the funny thing is that when I had finished that 21-month state sentence, if they had let me out of prison then, I would have never been able to rebuild my life. I was not at a place where I was strong enough to move forward and make changes in my life and stand up for myself. And those extra 6 months that I got were the biggest blessing ever, because that's when I really grew. And that's when I really became strong enough to stand on my own and stand up for myself and not be controlled by other people.
Oh, that's so interesting. Okay, so before hitting that big mindset shift
Mhm.
of growth and strength, were you kind of in that like victim mentality of this happened to me, or were you in a blaming yourself, guilt and shame mindset? Like what was going on with you
That's
kind of those.
really interesting that you use those words, because my book is all about, I actually use victim and I relate it to, you can be a victim or you can be a victor. So you can either let your circumstances rule you, or you can take charge and move forward and choose the direction you're going to go. So from the very beginning, of course, there was a lot of shame. Shame, what I was riddled with shame. I mean, it was so embarrassing. You're on TV and your hair's not combed, and you're wearing black and white stripes. I mean, there's nobody that looks good on TV when they're coming from prison. It just can't happen. And so that was embarrassing for me. I struggled a lot with shame, but the one thing I did not struggle with was being a victim, because I knew before I could even put words to it, there were so many people who wanted me to say that John Maynard had manipulated me into doing this. And I refused to say it. I never once said it, not even from the first day, because I realized that if I let myself be a victim, I could never not be a victim. And I did not want to be known as a victim. I did not want to act like a victim. So I stood up and said from the beginning, I made a choice. I could have said no. I chose to do this. And I never, ever let anybody put words in my mouth that said that I was manipulated into helping John escape from prison.
Do you think you would have been able to had that awareness of that concept of if I was a victim, then I'd always be a victim? Do you think you would have had that awareness had you not been through what you'd already been through in your life in terms of not really taking control of it, but instead always taking the back seat?
I don't think so. I think that here's an interesting thing. I was on this huge pedestal. I mean, I was running this largest prison dog program in the country. I was on the news all the time. People in the community looked up to me. And that's when you're in that kind of a position, you have to be aware of how you look to the world and you have to keep up that facade. But when you fall off of a pedestal, especially one that's pretty high, you are at rock bottom and there's nothing more you can lose. And so I believe that it was necessary for me to get to that rock bottom so that I had to completely rebuild everything. I couldn't just keep parts of the old Toby and move on. I had to completely start over. And that was a blessing too, because, J.K. Rowling said it in a commencement address at Harvard University. And she said, I found that rock bottom is a very solid foundation on which to build a life. And that's exactly how I felt. I had nowhere to go but up. I could only move forward. I could only move up because there was no further down that I could fall. And in a lot of ways, that was so refreshing because I didn't have to worry about what people thought of me anymore. I didn't have to worry about keeping up this persona of perfection. I could just take little baby steps forward, and it was a move forward, and be proud of that.
I love that because it I don't know, I just had like a little aha moment in terms of rock bottom because I've heard that before, and there's all these great quotes about rock bottom and the change that can come from that and all that, but it really is then you get to kind of finally release all the expectations you're constantly trying to live up to that exist on every layer of life, and so then it's kind of like, all right, well, that's all off my shoulders now.
Yeah. So, okay, everybody's seen me without my hair colored and without my hair combed and without my hair cut. And they've seen me in black and white. They've seen me with no makeup. They've seen me, dragged out of a police car. Okay. So today I have to do this thing. That's nothing. I can handle that.
Okay, I love that. All right, so how did you start this process? Like, how did you start to did you first have to tackle the shame component, or did you first have to tackle like letting go of the love for John Maynard? Like, what was your order of self-work?
The first thing I had to tackle was not letting myself be a victim. That was the first thing that I had to tackle. And then the second thing that I started to work on was the shame, letting go of the shame. And I'll tell you what, that was the hardest one for me. And I still to this day have to intentionally force myself to not feel shame about some things because shame was so deeply ingrained in me. Guilt, that was the biggest thing. I was guilty about everything. And my husband today, I'll tell him, oh, I'm so sorry. He said, quit being sorry. You didn't do anything to be sorry about. Just quit. And so I have to really force myself to let go of that guilt burden that I've carried my whole life.
How did you do that?
I spent a lot of time in prison writing. I have about 24 journals that I filled while I was in prison. And I believe that there are things inside of us, things in our soul, things in our psyche, things in our spirit that we acknowledge, but we could never say them out loud. And so if you sit and you write in a journal, I found that I wrote things that I never even thought about before. And once you write something down, then you can let yourself read it, which then lets you acknowledge it. And once you acknowledge it, then you can start to heal it. But as long as it's buried so deeply down in you that you don't even acknowledge it's there, you can't begin to start to heal it.
I love that. Yes, it's like exposing the wound. Like wounds
Yes.
need air to
Yes.
heal.
Hmm. And I found that anything that made me cry, anything that made me hurt, anything that made me feel bad meant that I had to go there. That's where I needed to go. And I had to dig out those wounds and clean out that pus and pull away all those scabs so that it could heal properly. Because if I just buried it, it just festered and it never went away.
Yes. I love that. That's that whole concept of, okay, when I'm upset, when I'm hurt, when I'm angry, whatever it is, a negative experience, to
Mhm.
instead view that as like an opportunity for insight and to like learn
Yes.
more about myself and heal myself more has been like life changing for me over the
Yes.
past probably like 2 years.
It absolutely has. And so in prison, you don't have a lot of opportunity to get help. I mean, they have counselors in prison, but they're not really there to help you. They're just there to say that they had somebody there if you needed to talk to somebody. So I did a lot of introspection and a lot of journaling while I was in prison, and kind of helped put my mind around where I wanted to have this vision I wanted for my life when I got out. And then after I got out of prison, I was so fortunate to meet my husband, who has just been the keel to my life. You know, I kind of feel like my life was this boat that leaned to the right and then leaned to the left, and it was always on the verge of tipping one way or the other. And Chris, I always say he's my keel. He just keeps me straight in the water and keeps me from those, far flung variances of emotion. He just kind of keeps me on the straight and narrow. That was a beautiful thing for me. And Chris needed me as much as I needed him, which I think really makes a strong relationship. So I always say he was my keel and I was his anchor, because Chris didn't have a home. He just had no intention of putting roots down. He was sleeping on friends' couches. And so together we kind of made each other so much more than we could ever be by ourselves.
Did he, when you met him, did he recognize you from the news? Like, did he know who you were?
No, when I met him, he was, we worked together, and he was going to, one of the workers, he did construction work, and one of the workers that they had hired had gotten arrested for a DUI. And I'd only known him for a week, and he was sitting at a desk across from me, and he said, I'm going to write to Oscar and see what it would take to bond him out. And I said, well, do you know his inmate number? Because you need to put that on the envelope or they won't get the letter to him. And he looked at me and he said, how would you know about writing letters to people in jail? And I said, oh, I just know that. And I didn't say any more. Well, he went home that night and Googled me. And then he came back
Oh
in the
boy,
next
yep.
day and said, we need to talk. And Chris has always just been fascinated with my story. And so within 5 months or so, I ended up needing to move back to Kansas City. That was in Boston where I met Chris. And Chris said, well, I'll just come with you. I'll help you drive home. And I don't know where I'm going to start my life over, but I need to find a place to rebuild my life too. And I suppose it could be in Kansas City just as easy as it could be in Boston. And so we were good friends for about a year. And then that friendship just grew beyond friendship. But I think that's one of the reasons our relationship's so strong too, because we didn't start out with this romantic, all consuming head over heels kind of a relationship. We started out as friends, and we built this really solid foundation that we could then build a deeper relationship on.
Mm-hmm. Is the type of relationship, like that type of relationship, is that one of the things you kind of thought about when you were in prison and were more intentional about, of like, okay, the next relationship I get in, I want it to, look like this or not look like this? Like, was that part of the work you did?
Well, that was a little bit of it. But honestly, when I was in prison, I was determined to never be in another relationship. I'd had these two relationships in my life, and they were both disastrous in totally different ways. And so I just said, I'm just going to be by myself. I'm just going to get a dog, and I'm going to be by myself, and I'm going to be happy. And so Chris and I really kind of, each of us resisted letting our relationship progress beyond friendship. And we actually rented a house together, a 2-bedroom house, and we were roommates. And we really kept ourselves at arm's length from each other because neither one of us were really looking for a relationship. But then, it just kind of happened.
Yes. Yep. Okay. So back to prison for a minute. So shame. I love that. What other things did you have to do?
Choosing to not be a victim. That's all about perspective. I mean, perspective is a huge part of it. And so you can look at anything, like even this quarantine that we've been in for 2 weeks now, and you're locked in your house. A lot of people, I've seen people on Facebook saying, I can't stand it anymore. And I'm like, I'll reply to them and say, read a book, write a poem, write a story, draw something. You can stand it. Don't say you can't stand it, because when you say I can't take this anymore, then you can't take it anymore. But if you don't let yourself say I can't take it anymore, then guess what? You're going to get through it just fine. So you asked me about 3 things: being a victim, guilt, and letting go of loving John Maynard. And loving John, letting go of that was the last thing that I did while I was in prison. I mean, for the first year, maybe 2 years that I was in prison, I just mooned over him and just, worried about what he was going through and cried over him. And then all of a sudden one day I thought, this is the stupidest thing ever. I am wasting so much time on this. I just need to let go right now. Just drop it and you're moving on. Because there's no future in this relationship. It's not going to happen. So just let go and move on. And that's what I did.
Wow. It was that, I don't want to say easy because I know it's not easy, but it was that simple of just
telling myself to do it. Yeah. I had to first accept inside that was not going to happen. And I just needed to get over it before I could get over it. And then once I acknowledged that this wasn't going to continue, then it was so much easier to let go of it.
Did you have any communication with him after you guys got caught and you went to prison?
Well, here's the thing. Inmates can't write to each other unless it gets approved, like it's your brother or sister or something like that. But I would get letters from John, and they would be kind of cryptic. And he would send a drawing. He was really good at drawing. So I would get a drawing in the mail from somebody that I didn't know. And I just knew it was John's drawing. I could tell. But I don't know how he knew where I was or how to get mail there. And so the last thing that happened, which is when I really let go of him, I got this message. Somebody came over to me and that was in my pod in prison and said, hey, I have a message for you. And they had gotten a letter in the mail from somebody who said, find Toby and give her this. And the message said, I'm your knight in shining armor, and I wish I could just ride in and rescue you from that tower that they have you imprisoned in. And I knew that was from John. And when I read that, I was like, oh, and then I was like, that is the stupidest thing ever. This is not a fairy tale. You cannot ride in and rescue me. I have to be done with this because it's not a fairy tale. This is real life. And so that message really is the one that was kind of the catalyst that let me say, no, I'm done. This isn't real. I can't do this.
So that's interesting because I remember from a little bit of his story in the other podcast I heard you on that, I mean, he had been in prison since he was young, right? Like he got there
17.
Okay.
He'd been in prison since he was 17. Yeah.
Yeah. So he doesn't really, I don't know, that could, I guess, just change his perspective of real life. You know what I mean? Like it wasn't like prison was real life to him. And that probably makes
That's right.
the fantasy world easier to fantasize about. Whereas you're like, hold on, I'm in prison. This is not the real life I want.
That's right. And, I think that kind of, just like they say, if someone starts doing drugs or starts abusing alcohol, at whatever age they start doing that, their emotional development kind of stops there. I think that's true too for prison. And I think John was just kind of stuck at being a 17-year-old kid, even though, it was 10 years later and now it's 25 years later. And I think he's just going to be destined to be stuck as this 17-year-old kid.
Oh, I'm sure. And I mean, in my unprofessional, uneducated opinion, I just think that makes sense that I'm sure you have some continued developmental growth and maturation, but not like you would if you were out in life and all these different circumstances and interacting with these different people and different relationships and all the things we all go through that, make us grow.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. So I think that even in the 2 weeks when we were out, John, to watch him interact with the world, it was so obvious that he was in a different world. He was back in the day when they had pagers and, things were different. And even, when I got out of prison, while I was in prison, they came out with a smartphone and they came out with Facebook. And when I got out of prison, I could not it took me a while to adjust to the things that had happened while I was gone. And a lot of things happen in 2 years, let alone 10 or 25.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Life is different. Life is completely different.
Mm-hmm.
And you've been like paused for a while. And then now it's like, you've got to hit the ground running.
Yes, that's right.
And so I know now that is something that you're working towards helping other women with.
So last year, shortly before Christmas, my husband said to me, I've written a memoir and I've got an agent and we're working on getting it shopped to a publisher right now. And he said to me, Toby, I think your memoirs are great. You're going to be able to reach the lives of a lot of women out there and change their lives too, which is the reason why I wrote the memoir. And he said, but I think you need to have some kind of a movement. I think you need to be an advocate for something. So what's that thing that you're so passionate about? What is it that you're going to do? What is it you're going to continue to do for the rest of your life? And I said, the key to my survival in prison was that I realized I could use that time for my benefit. I didn't have to sit there and say, oh, I'm serving 21 months. Oh, I'm serving 27 months. Oh my gosh, 3 months from now, I'm going to get out. I didn't have to do any of that. Instead, I said, I have this huge gift of all this time. So how am I going to use it to start rebuilding myself so that when I get out of here, I can hit the ground running? And so I decided that I was going to create a series of workbooks for women in prison that does just that. And because they may not know how to just do it on their own, my first workbook is a 12-week workbook. And each week I guide them through a different principle. And one of them is shame. And one of them is perspective. And one of them is having a vision. And one of them is being grateful. And, one of them is having courage. And so each week there's a series of 6 different exercises for that particular topic that really starts them on that path to cultivating courage and cultivating letting go of shame and building a vision for their future. And it's actually a workbook that they have exercises to do and they can write right in it. So I finished that workbook and people love it. And women who aren't in prison want to buy it. I've sold several copies because they said these exercises apply too. You don't have to be in prison to do this. And so now we have 2 more workbooks that we're working on. When I say we, I mean my husband and I. And we have 3 more workbooks on the drawing board that we're planning. And each one of them is different. So the first one is Butterflies Unleashed, and it's a story of transformation and how to start transforming your life. The next book we're going to release is called Be Unleashed. And we talk about the honeybees and this sense of community that they have and how they have to work so hard to fit into their community. And that book I'm kind of targeting for women that are being released from prison and trying to, fit back into their community in a productive way. And we have a book about resilience, and we have a book about being a catalyst, and we have a book about being a leader. And so, just different topics that I think are important for self-development in women.
I love that so much. I think that is just absolutely helpful for anybody. But then that specific niche of women in prison, I think is just incredible. Is the first book Is the first workbook in prisons now, or are you still
in
that process?
I'm in that process, but I do have a prison here in Missouri lined up. And before the coronavirus thing, they were going to start using the workbook in April. I think that's going to be delayed a little bit now. But, and I've talked to several other places. I've talked to a halfway house that's interested in using it, prison in West Virginia. So, I'm just trying to get the word out there and talk to different prisons. Now, when you work with prisons, nothing happens very fast. So, it takes some time. But I've also started a program where women in the community can sponsor the program for a woman in prison or an underprivileged woman who can't afford to buy it herself. And I have that on the website now, and I've already got a couple of people who bought sponsorships. So we're trying to address the problem of how do we get this book into anybody's hands that needs it, regardless of whether they have the money to pay for a book or not.
I think that's absolutely incredible. Thank you so
You're
much
welcome.
for coming on and sharing your story, and just for your honesty in terms of everything that you've been through. And I love your insights on perspective, which I think is very relevant right now, as
yes,
we're not necessarily in prison, but some would argue we're in the prison of our own homes.
That's right.
Tell everybody what the website is, where they can find more information about you and the work that you're doing.
Okay. I have two websites. The one is my name, Toby, Toby, Dorr, Dorr, 102 R's, TobyDorr.com. That's the website about my story and my memoir. And then theunleashedseries.com are the workbooks that we're putting together. And we have all the workbooks listed out there. We have the ones that are ready to sell out there for sale. And we also have the sponsorship package out there for people to be able to sponsor other women. So that's theunleashedseries.com.
Perfect. And I will link to all of that in the show notes. Toby, thank you so much.
You're welcome, Casey. I was happy to do it.
All right, that will do it for today's episode. Thank you again for listening. Want to remind everybody that my book, I Gave Up Men for Lent, the story of a jaded, hopelessly romantic, health-conscious party girl's search for meaning, is still available for free to listen to on the podcast. That's episodes 27, 28, 29, I think. I believe that's it. And that will be up through April 12th. So if you're interested in listening to the book for free, go ahead and check that out. There's a couple more weeks to do that. If you're not already following the podcast on the socials, please do so. We are on Instagram and Facebook at The Better You Podcast. You can also reach me to give me any feedback or topic suggestions, guest suggestions at thebetteryoupodcast@gmail.com. And I think that is it. Thank you all again so much for listening. Please rate and review the podcast. Have a wonderful rest of your day.